Okay, so my computer's clock says that it's exactly 3 o'clock in Finland. So probably something else in other parts of the world, but meaning that we could start. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see the slide.
Yes.
Can see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great, excellent. So yeah, welcome everyone to the LOD publication for libraries workshop by the LIBER Linked Open Data Working Group. And so yeah, a couple of words first about the sort of the technical aspects of the webinar. So first of all, the session will be recorded, so hopefully that won't be a problem for anyone. Then second, we are using this AnyMeeting system that is very open and meant for sort of for web meetings. So so you all have quite a bit of responsibility. First of all, I believe that everyone has a mute all button. Please don't press it. And also, please keep your mics muted when you are not speaking, just to keep the sort of the sound waves clear. And if you wish to talk, ask a question or comment or whatever, we don't have a raise your hand functionality, but we do have that chat window, and please write there that you wish to comment or ask a question. And we have two moderators, Elias and David, who will monitor the chat and give you the deal out the possibilities to ask and comment. As for the agenda for today, the workshop is sort of in two parts. So the first part is 3 presentations. We have semantic interoperability between bibliographic models by Sofia Tsapounido, Michalis Spakakis, and Christos Papatheodorou. And then we have a presentation about the challenge of interoperability between entity models, share VDE experience by Tiziana Possemato and Anna Leonetti. And finally, we have CERL's CERL's resources as linked open data presentation presented by Andreas Walker. And after the 3 presentations, they will be about 20 minutes each, and with 5 to 10 minutes for discussion, questions, and comments. And after the 3 presentations, we'll have a break for stretching and getting a fresh cup of coffee and whatever else. And after that break, we'll have the sort of the second part of the workshop, which will be a discussion about the document, the best practices of library linked open data publication that you hopefully got in advance. If you haven't had a chance to go through it yet, no problem. We'll present it like sort of briefly, and then we'll go through it like section by section, and after each section there will be a possibility to ask questions or give comments or whatever. So we're hoping to have a quite a like an interactive workshop, even though we aren't in the same physical space. And yeah, that's about it. So I wish you all a very rewarding workshop. And does anyone have any questions about the workshop itself at this point? And if not, then I'll have Sophia have the floor.
Thank you, Matthias. I think that I cannot activate my webcam because it says a max of 12 webcams can be displayed.
Okay.
So probably somebody has. Okay.
Well.
Okay, now you can see me. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Hi, my name is Sofia Zaponidou. So this is a warm greeting from Greece. I'm going to present our project. It's called Semantic Interoperability Between Bibliographic Models. My co-authors are Professors Fakakis and Papatheodorou. Our presentation has 3 sections. Firstly, we are presenting the problem that we try to solve. Then we shortly present the project and some good practices that we have found along the way. So we hear a lot about semantic web and linked open data, and we know that it's not just technology, it's also a set of principles. We can make our stuff, anything, available on the web with an open license. We can make it available as structured data in a non-proprietary format. We can denote things with URIs, and when we provide links to external data sets, we provide context. So what do models, bibliographic models in this case, do? They define what are the things we want to talk about, what are the characteristics and their relationships between them.
You aren't currently sharing the slides.
I'm not sharing the slides. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Whoa. I thought that I turned on the button. Okay. Why I did that? Can you see it now? Sorry. Can you see my screen now?
Yes. Now we can.
Okay. Sorry. Okay.
No, but it was easy to follow along. So.
Okay. Okay, so as I have told you, have introduction, the project, and the good practices. The linked open data, the 5 stars, that we can upload something online in a structured way, in a non-proprietary format. We can denote things with URIs, and when we link to other data without context. So the models, and as I have already told you, the bibliographic models, they define what are the things we want to talk about, what are the things in the bibliographic universe, what are the characteristics and the relationships between them. So in this slide, you can see the models, some well-known models, of course, others exist. F4BR is considered as a milestone in cataloging theory, and it's now consolidated by the LRM, the Library Reference Model. The object-oriented version of FRBR was developed to enable cooperation with museums, while the resource description and access is a set of rules for describing according to FRBR LRM primitives. The newest model is BibFrame, is being developed by the Library of Congress, and the main aim for its development was to enable the conversion of legacy MARC records to linked data. So even though all these models are in the same domain, they have some important differences regarding the entities, the things that they recognize in the bibliographic universe, the characteristics of these entities, and their relationships between them. Of course, we already have some data sets implementing these models. The national libraries of Spain and France, they implement FRBR, while Germany, Library of Congress, of course, and Sweden implement BibFrame. But difference exists not just because some data sets implement different models, but differences exist even between data sets implementing the same model. And as research has shown that there are differences regarding selected element sets and selected control vocabularies. So the problem is that, of course, linked data is created and we don't have any technical interoperability issue, but the understanding of the created data is not ensured. And this is a semantic interoperability issue. And already we have some concerns raised by scholars, which they ask, this is a well-known article, that are we going from mark silos to linked data silos? So this is the question that we tried to answer. Is semantic interoperability between bibliographic models feasible? Is there some common ground? Can there be mappings? Are there any prerequisites or good practices that enable semantic interoperability? So in order to do that, we initiated our project. On the top of the slide, you can see the URL. And this project had 3 phases. In the first phase, we studied the models. We studied some models in order to identify similarities and divergences between them. So we tried to answer, can we reconcile differences? And we used these similarities and differences in mappings. And we tried to understand if there are any prerequisites for better mappings. And after the mappings in the third phase, we tried to assess the mappings by using gold datasets. And we asked if the mappings are successful and if there is some loss of semantics. Here is an example from the study of models regarding core entities or classes. So you can see FRBR, LRM, RDA, object-oriented FRBR, BibFrame, and EDM, which is cultural heritage model. So you can see the core entities and their more or less equivalents in the other models. And through these tables, we try to understand, okay, what's similar and what's not. Another table regarding relationships was created also. Here you can see 2 examples for derivative relationships, adaptation, translation, equivalence, and aggregates. So we try to understand and we try to find out how each case was represented, may be represented in its model. After we have identified similarities and differences, we try to reconcile its identified difference. So in the second table, you can see a column which says project's approach. At this point, I must say that we use the Hasselhoff class categorization of metadata heterogeneities. So after the study of models and after we selected the methods, how to reconcile the differences, we generated the mappings. So the core findings from the mappings and the assessment, they can be shown in this slide. These core findings refer to representation approaches. I will tell you what I mean with it. The selection of control vocabularies, the loss of semantics in certain cases, but mostly important, the importance of cataloging policy in semantic interoperability, and some typical examples follow. Models enable different representation approaches without violating the primitives. But we must keep in mind that each approach may trigger a different mapping. And now I'm going to show you 3 different ways that we can represent 2 BibFrame works without violating BibFrame primitives. So here we have 2 works. They both contain the ideas of Kazantzaki's Odyssey, but they realize these ideas in 2 different languages, Greek and English. This is a simple representation. We have no information at hand regarding possible relationships between them, so the works remain unrelated. In case this is a second representation approach, also enabled by BibFrame semantics. In this approach, the two works are related with two has-expression property instances. So with these representations, we express that both BibFrame works share the same content, Kazantzakis Odyssey, but in different signs in different languages, Greek and English. This is another representation approach, also enabled by BibFrame. In this case, we have on the left a BibFrame work that lacks important information according to the definition of the BibFrame. So it lacks science-related information. And this work has two expressions, the two works on the right. And even though this seems to be alike with FRBR, LRM, or RDA, it's not, because the two works on the right still carry both ideas and signs, so they cannot be considered as equivalent to RDA expressions. This is, according to the Library of Congress approach, the basic mapping from RDA to BibFrame. A whole path, an RDA path, work has expression of work expression, can be mapped to a BibFrame work. It seems simple, right? Well, it's not that simple, and I'm going to show you an example. Here we have a work, an RDA work, with 4 expressions. For each path, work has expression of work expression, a new BibFrame work will be generated. But how are we going to generate these BibFrame works? We can generate them without using the has expression property. So after the mapping, these 4 works, BibFrame works, remain unrelated to one another. Another representation approach that we can use in the mapping is to relate in pairs all the generated works using the has expression property. So in this case, the more expressions an RDA work has, the more has expression instances are going to be generated after the mapping. And the third representation approach is to use the has expression property, but as a transitive one. So we need much fewer number of has expression instances, and we represent the same information, that all the related BibFrame works share the same ideational content. So these are 3 different representation approaches, 3 different mappings. Another finding is that control vocabularies. We must be very careful when we're selecting a control vocabulary, because some values may trigger mappings. So we have here, the typical path. The work has expression of work expression. So we are expecting to generate a BibFrame work, but because of a property value that has content type txt, this value triggers the mapping. So a BibFrame work subclass instance is generated, the text subclass. In case this value, the text value, changes and it becomes tactile test, then 2 mappings are triggered. First, the BibFrame work, the BibFrame text subclass is generated, but also triggers the mapping of the manifestation to instance, to an instance subclass, which is called tactile. So vocabulary is important mapping. Different mappings triggered. We have some theories of the same work that are related with an is a bridge relation relation. Okay, I'm sorry. Here we have two expressions of two different works, and they also are related. And again, the relationship is preserved after the mapping, but the exact semantic is lost. Another similar example. And we also have found out that there is some problem, let's say, some noise regarding the mapping of RDA work-to-work relationships. Here we have two works. The first one has two expressions, and the second expression. The two works are related with the relationship is adapted as libretto work. According to the mapping that we have shown you earlier, each path work has expression work will generate a BIP framework. So all three generated BIP frameworks will carry all the semantics from the RDA work and RDA expressions. So they will carry also the relationship. So this mapping must be created. But is this true? Do really these two BIP frameworks on the left have as derivative the work on the right? What we have found out that when this when work-to-work relationships are being mapped from RDA to BIP frame, what they do is generate many erroneous relationships. So what we have asked ourselves, do we map them? Decided not to. We decided to ignore work-to-work relationship because they provided a false context of relationship between the generated BIP frameworks. After the mappings, what we did, we tried to assess them. So we used real-world cases, 11 bibliographic families, well-known bibliographic families that have many derivatives and have been published in many different languages. We also tried to make some research regarding the publishing history in order to identify more relationships. Using these cases, we created gold data sets, and we use these gold data sets to convert and assess our mappings. So, for example, the gold RDA data set was converted to BIP frame, and the generated data set was later compared to gold BIP frame to assess the mapping. This is the web page of our project, where you can find the tools, the data, and visualizations that our work has created. So some core findings. Difference exists, but may be reconciled. We must think a lot about the representation approaches that we use because they may trigger different mappings. And as we have seen that some property values may be used to trigger mappings, then we can easily understand that the selection of vocabularies may play a role in mappings and in semantic interoperability. Another important thing was that, as we have seen, work-to-work relationships, so they are lost. But if we have expression-to-expression relationships, then they are preserved after the mappings, even though there is some loss of semantics. So the level on which a bibliographic relationship is represented may impact interoperability. Some good practices use commonly accepted representation approaches. For example, in the library domain, translations are perceived as new expressions of the same work, while in the publishing industry, translations are perceived as new works. So we must keep that in mind. Also, represent relationships at the science level, if possible, if there is such information on hand. We know that this is not that easy, and in our research, we used a lot of research by scholars regarding the publishing history of these 11 bibliographic families. So if you have such information in hand, then prefer to represent relationship between expressions in RDA or between BIP frameworks and BIP frame. Use control vocabularies, well known if possible, and use the has a property for common to represent that some works share common ideational content. So, as a final takeaway, what we have seen as findings and good practices are not all are not technology related, but are related to the cataloging policy. So the cataloging policy may play a crucial role in minimizing the loss of semantics after conversion. So when you develop a new policy or you're updating an existing one, try to understand the model semantics, the core models in your field, and then you may formulate your cataloging policy accordingly. Hopefully, afterwards, the data sets, the linked data sets that you are going to create, more usable, and you will liberate them from the market. You will not have them in a linked data silo, as it has already been stated. So, thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm at your disposal.
So if someone has any questions, maybe he could or she could turn on his camera shortly and ask the question. Maybe that would be easier to do. And yeah, ask the question and then we'll have the answer, hopefully. Or in the chat, yeah.
Or in the chat, or in the notes, wherever.
Yep. Okay, we are maybe getting several people are typing, so.
Sophia, are you seeing the first question? Should we repeat it?
Have you considered evaluating quality of repositories? No, we have not considered it because we have seen that other scholars have done that. For example, Kim Talaras did a related project where he used the 4 national libraries data sets, and he saw the quality and the problems. For example, he saw that they use different element sets and different vocabularies. How do you think the activities of subject indexers will change? I don't know. There is an issue about it. I don't think that it will be fully automated. I think that subject indexing is the last place that we're going to be afraid about being about the automation. I think it's the most difficult thing. Okay, let's try to with the descriptive data, with the cataloging data first, and to have relationships in order to enable really linked data sets, and then we will see indexing. I see someone else is typing, if I'm right. And thank you, Gustavo Cantella, for your questions.
And Anna also, eh? The last
and
question.
Anna also, yes. Sorry, Anna. Oh, you're working on that, on the subject indexing. Okay, that's interesting. Well, we haven't yet. Of course, we tried to find some policies, but we couldn't find exactly what the policies are. So you try to find the policies by looking at the data sets, which is the other way around, actually. We think that, of course, maybe some local adaptations are going to be expected, but what we say to librarians, what we say to catalogists is that before you proceed with election, think it. If there is another way that you can do it, or be sure about it, and have in mind that this local adaptation may affect interoperability. Thank you, Marilise. It seems like a Greek name.
And if someone wants to make a follow-up, he or she is welcome to do so. If someone wants to talk, maybe talk about their own policies, maybe in their libraries.
Yeah. If there are no further questions, then I thank you, Sophia.
Thank you very much.
Super interesting topic, and I think that the semantic interoperability is certainly the thing that we need to sort of discuss and get to work in order to fully realize the sort of the possibilities of library linked open data.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. And next we have Tiziana telling us about share VDE. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, I tried to share my screen. Oh, no. My Mac doesn't give me the ability to share my screen. I'm sorry. Anna, can you share the screen and I present?
Yes, okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. I prefer not to lose time in change something in my...
Just give me a minute.
Also, you have some problem, Anna? Otherwise, I will ask to Matthias to share.
Yeah.
Matthias, can you help me in sharing?
Yeah.
Because it's something related to permission of my notebook. I don't know why.
Yeah. Just a minute.
It should work in Chrome, I think, the Chrome browser. Otherwise, you might
I
need
have
a program.
Chrome. I have Chrome, but I have a new Mac, and probably I need a defined setting for authorization. Okay, so I send you something like to go ahead. Okay, thank you. Thank you. So the Share VD is a library-driven initiative which brings together the bibliographic catalog and authority files of a community of libraries in a shared discovery environment based on linked data. Okay. And the publication of the converted data to the Share VD discovery platform raised several challenges. We started from the analysis of the approach of an end user to the search, comparing a traditional search and discovery environment here represented on the left, with the new idea of a discovery system on the right that brings together data coming from different sources but presented in a user-friendly way. Okay. The purpose of the analysis was to find a way to match the complexity of enriched data with the simplicity in retrieving this data by end user. The shared with, okay, go ahead. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. The shared with the public discovery platform where the linked data of participating libraries is published has to accurately represent the entity model, but also provide an intuitive experience, seamless navigation and rich resource to the end users, both library patrons and professional users. As a result, a new advanced discovery interface is being developed to harness the potential of linked data and deliver ever more wide-ranging and detailed search result. The search function focuses on the entities to be presented to the final user, for example, the agent or the original work. But behind these entities hides the complex identification, distinction, and presentation of them. So please go ahead. The SharePD community has initially adopted BibFrame as its entity model to be applied to the incoming MARC data of libraries that are converted and published in linked data. As I said before, the publication of the converted data on the platform raised several challenges. And there was the need to publish the data reflecting the underlying entity model, but hiding its complexity to the end user. The simpler, the better is the leitmotif that has guided the graphical but also functional choices for the portal. Okay. But behind the scenes, a complex logical and technological layer balances complexity and simplicity. Each entity is as much as possible well identified in its attributes and its relationship, extending in a tremendous way the ability to retrieve information. Go ahead. This mediation between complexity and simplicity is also highly dependent on the type of entity represented. Much easier with the agent. See here, William Shakespeare. Go ahead. But not exactly the same with its intellectual work. The identification of the original work was not as simply as expected at the early stages of this process. Go ahead. It becomes clear that through analysis and reconsideration of the entity model was essential for the identification and reconciliation of entities, as well as for the presentation and the distribution of the data handled by ShareVD to its discovery platform and to external parties. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead again. As said before, ShareVD community had initially adopted the BibFrame as its entity model to be applied to the incoming MARC data. The scenario got even more complex when different bibliographic cultures intertwined the ShareVD community. The national libraries of Norway and Finland and the British Library that joined ShareVD along with a pool of libraries from US and Canada are traditionally oriented to IFLA LRM model. Therefore, the issue of maintaining as much interoperability as possible between different approaches to entity modeling that converge in ShareVD needed to be faced. Go ahead. So the new challenge, the interoperability with the LRM model and its complexity, starting from BibFrame. So please go ahead. Analysis of Mark II BibFrame conversion through the ShareVD Transformation Council reinforced the efficacy of BibFrame work as currently outlined in the model, which provides an appropriate cluster of elements corresponding to work and expression level elements in IFLA LRM. It does not seem necessary or practical to manage a separate cluster solely for expression level elements. At the same time, justification for testing the application of an additional entity with the scope to better identify a work and to group different expression of the same work is based on different key arguments. Please go ahead. The solution adopted in order to allow for broader compatibility was to reshape the model and implement a 4-layered adaptation of BibFrame that comprises 4 main entities: the opus, the work, the instance, and the item. Go ahead. So, a new challenge, the identification of the original work. In the ShareVD portal, the grouping ability for the purpose of enhancing the user navigation function is proposed starting from each entity. But if the agent and its attributes and the relationship is usually clear design in different data model, both for researchers and for librarians, the work is a more complex entity due to the high degree of abstraction. So two question was obliged and we need to answer. How can we represent this abstraction without losing the effectiveness of the expression? And how do we extract the intellectual content from the BF work, the work in BibFrame, that is the sum of both abstract content and concrete representation? So adding a new level, a sort of extension to BibFrame, and this allows to separate the intellectual content and to make possible the identification of the original work. Go ahead. So to overcome the challenge of identifying the original work and keep interoperability with other models, we introduce the new entity as a superwork that in February 2020 was renamed as Opus for a certain number of reasons that the group discussed. So go ahead. The analysis in the dedicated ShareVD working group consider it as starting point of 4 different models, 4 different scenarios. And the main attempt was to identify among many works at the same level, so presented in the BibFrame model, the original work of an author. That means the opus in its original Latin meaning. The aggregating power of an opus is the ability to bound together all variants and publication of an abstract work. And so to achieve this goal, option 3 and option 4 of the original 4 model were identified as most suitable to the modeling requirements. Go ahead. And this is the so-called option 3. And we have also the next slide, the so-called option 4, that is more flexible and interoperable with the BibFrame and LRM. Analyzing requirement by requirement, the final choice was made for option 4, this option. Here, resource that is a ShareVD opus is also a BibFrame work. Likewise, a resource that is a ShareVD work is also a BibFrame work. So go ahead. Starting from requirements set within the working group focused on the analysis of the entity model, we have analyzed the similarities and the differences of the two options. Here are some examples of the comparison of how option 3 and 4 comply with these requirements. We started from some desired model feature, for example, an entity representing the abstract work of the BIB framework class is needed. Any ShareVD opus shall be regarded as a BF work. And we analyzes the solution proposed by option 3 on the left and option 4 on the right. So go ahead with another example in the next slide. For example, the desired feature, an entity representing the expression-like entities of the BF work class is needed. Any ShareVD work shall be regarded as a BF work. So again, for these specific requirements, a representation in option 3 and in option 4. And at the end, we decided, next slide, for the option 4 entity model. And so, as I told before, the aggregating power of an opus here is very evident. That is the ability to bound locate together all variants and publication of an abstract work. So go ahead. And so here is the current ShareVD model simplified, of course. And the next slide represents the future ShareVD model simplified, where also a new entity, that is the instance as an entity, is included, but this is not the context to speak about this. It will be in the next occasion. So go ahead with the next. Yes, so where we are now, the goal is to finalize the work done so far and choose the model that best fits the purpose of identification, description, conversion, and maintenance of ShareVD data, also taking into account interoperability issues with other model. So how we can go ahead with this discussion, review the ShareVD opus in details, and really modeling the ShareVD opus with attributes and the relationship. Go ahead. And this is represented in this extraction of a spreadsheet where the group is working to better identify really the properties and the relationship, the attributes of this new entity that is the ShareVD opus. Go ahead. And just to close, as the discussion among the ShareVD members and in the broader linked data community moved forward, it came to light that the ShareVD public discovery platform, where the linked data of libraries are published, has to accurately represent the entity model, but also provide intuitive experience, seamless navigation, and rich resources to the end user or to the user, both library patron and the professional user. Go ahead. So because of the common heart of the portal, that is the powerful search engine used as a starting point both for patrons and for professional users, again, a clear identification of entity become a must, and this is an essential requirement for a correct management of the entities. The transition from the conversion to creation and handling of the entity directly in RDF through the editor module named JCricket has similarly imposed this rethinking of the model. And starting from now and to the next slides, so please go ahead, you can see some of the design function that may make necessary this revision of the model with the ability to concretely work on entities. In this case, for example, merging two different works, this means two different options, or to, for example, to going ahead to create some relationship between an opus and the publication, the last one. And so to conclude, to finish, this new approach to a new entity model that put together BibFrame and LRM should give us the ability to be free in defining this new kind of approach on entity management system, moving from the publication of linked data to the creation and managing of linked data. Thank you. The last one is thanks. If you have any comments or question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tiziana. That was very interesting and somehow very a very natural continuation of the previous presentation as well, showing
exactly.
like a specific comparison and mapping with the emphasis on semantic interoperability.
Yeah.
So do we have any questions from the attendees?
If no question, I can just try to answer to the previous question about the subject, because this is a very interesting topic that is on the table also for our project, because right now we have managed entities such as person, that means agent, and works, but the next step is the challenge to manage in the same way the subject, that is a bit more complicated, of course. And this is really a challenge in terms of clusterization. And we started working with one of the family of ShareVD, that is ShareArt, with a group of different libraries focused on art and history. And for them is really an opportunity to work on subject topic, and this will change completely the approach of librarian to this kind of topic.
So we have a comment from Anna.
We are from using this model in the general meta handling. Oh, this is a good question, but we are not so far. We bring in this initiative some other projects such as Sinopia, coming from LD4P, and Folio, that is the open source community, and also with JCricket, that is our editor to manage linked open data. This is all these kind of instruments. So Sinopia, that is a bit more concrete than Folio. Just in Folio, the discussion about these is started a few months ago, but both in Sinopia and in our ShareVD community with JCricket, this is the next step, but is very close to a concrete working environment, because this kind of app will make possible exactly the ability to concretely create data. And for example, the added value of Sinopia is the ability to manage directly, to create directly linked open data, applying a different data model. So without any constraint to apply only BibFrame or only LRM and so on. So it's a good choice and a good opportunity for librarians.
And then we have a question from Lucas Costa. What is the original format of the source metadata records in this system? Is it MARC? And do you have relations in your metadata between several instances of one work?
Yes, the original format was MARC, MARC 21 and UniMARC for another subfamily, subgroup of the family. And we are now, exactly now, with the group that was focused on entity identification. We are now working on the instance entity. At the first step of the project, we named the master instance just to indicate the instance as an entity, but now we decided to rename this as an instance entity. And this, we are working on algorithms to put together instances coming from different libraries in MARC 21 or UniMARC or also other formats, and to match information to produce a real entity in terms of instance. In this case, we will link together all different description coming from different library that will remain a local description, all linked together in one instance that will represent exactly the instance in BibFrame or the manifestation in LRM. So this is the current step where we are working.
Yeah. And then there was a final question. Amaryllis was starting to study the possibilities of applying LOD to the collection of their library, and he thought that a good practice would be related to adopting enriched subject indexes, for example, but converting the MARC records into any of the presented bibliographic models does it mean that they are already working with linked data?
Yeah. Okay. So good.
So yeah, it's like a first step, but as noted in the answers, the links are also a key component of linked data. And then there was a follow-up question that do we as a community have a shared strategy regarding linking to other repositories, or does anything go?
Do we as a community have a shared? Oh, Yes. If you mean other repositories in terms of additional sources, yes, this is one of the steps that is included in the workflow. But please confirm that is the meaning of the question. So if is the ability to link and to enrich your information with external sources. For example, Wikidata. Yes, exactly, with Wikidata. And one of the subgroup who is working on how to bridge external sources, not only in terms of enrichment, in terms of publication, but also when you will work and you create, for example, a new entity using JCricket, for example, how we can work in the meantime, exactly in the meantime with Wikidata, so that you can create directly an entity not still present on Wikidata and have the same entity linked with Wikidata on your ShareVD repository or vice versa. And exactly with the Wikidata, we have more or less completed the analysis of APIs that Wikidata make available to create physically this link. And our designers have started to design a specific function to bring Wikidata and to work in a contemporary to Wikidata and to your system. So yes, this is an interesting topic under analysis in our community.
Yeah. Well, one final question, because this is very specific. So, what is the difference between VDE Opus and RDA work, and between VDE work and RDA expression?
Okay, this is a question a bit complex because we are analyzing the ShareVD Opus. That again, it will be also a bib framework, but it will be more close to an RDA work, and as Opus, while the ShareVD work will be much more close to the RDA expression. So if I want to trying to do a comparison, the ShareVD Opus will be something like the RDA work, and the ShareVD work will be something like the RDA expression. But of course, this is a very general definition. In a real context, we are modeling this entity, defining which kind of attributes coming from BF work can be applied to an opus to better identify with the scope to identify the opus in a Latin sense. That means the original work of an author. Yes, exactly. So the Opus work instance looks very similar to work expression manifestation, and this is the final goal. But not going far from bib frame. So each entity will be at the same time also a bib frame work, so that library that usually work with bib frame can work together with a library that usually work with LRM. This is exactly the challenge of ShareVD. Why create a separate model at all? And also, this is interesting question. And this is the history, because the history of the group, because the group started with BibFrame, the original group that is based on US and Canada, and the main goal is to represent entity in BibFrame. But exactly, a BibFrame doesn't satisfy all needs of exactly of the theoretical librarian knowledge. And so if, for example, if you find to follow the relationship between work in BibFrame, even if you use the properties as expression, you will be able to follow the chain of works, but you will not be able to clearly identify the beginning of the chain of or of a hierarchy. So this necessity, this need started exactly with the scope to follow BibFrame, but to be able to define this starting point of a hierarchy. And is not strange that following this proposal, also the Library of Congress started an analysis and a discussion about this topic, and decided to introduce the hub as a new entity that is not exactly from a meaning viewpoint, but with the scope to put together different expressions, that means different works expressed in BibFrame as an hub. So it's a bit complex to explain the history and where we are now, but we will give you additional information.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and thank you for all the questions, and thank you for all the answers. So next we have Andreas, who will be presenting these several resources as linked open data. Go ahead.
All right, thank you for inviting us for this presentation. I'm here with my colleague Alexander Janke. I'm pointing to the slide, but he's not actually next to me, but he's somewhere here. And what I'm going to be presenting about is how we publish our resources at Searle as linked open data, and some of the things that we've learned from doing that over the past roughly 8 years. Let me just find, yes. So Searle is, if you're not familiar with it, the consortium of European research libraries. It's a consortium that was founded in the early 90s as a very library-driven initiative, initially with the goal of facilitating copy cataloging of early modern prints across European research libraries through what was then called the hand-pressed book database. And it's now expanded its scope in quite some ways. It's also hosting summer schools and providing internships and things like that with a focus on early modern prints. But one of the main areas of activity today is still the maintenance and development of an array of database resources on early modern printing. And a lot of those are being hosted and developed in Göttingen with us. So I'm mostly going to be talking about 2 databases today. The first one is the Heritage of the Printed Book Database, the HPB, which was formerly called the Hand-Pressed Book Database. And it's a database that holds roughly 8 million bibliographic records for items of European printing from roughly the time period of 1450 to 1830. So it's an aggregate library catalog from our member libraries and data suppliers. And the Searle Thesaurus, the CT, is about 1.5 million records with multilingual information on the names of printers, persons, corporations, and places, initially as they were found in imprints of early modern prints, but now also from a wide array of sources now, but always pertaining to early modern prints. It was originally a tool for search term expansion in the HPB, but has now become somewhat of a central data hub in our ecosystem of databases. And then we have an array of smaller, more research-focused databases around those. So I'm just going to name one example here on the slides, which is material evidence in Incunabula, MEI, which, for example, holds about 54,000 records of detailed provenance information for Incunabula copies. There's various others, which you can all see following the link on the slides. So I'm going to start with the thesaurus because it's the one that we first published as linked open data. And what you can see on the screen is an example for a place record, in that case, Göttingen. And what a typical thesaurus record holds is some basic information on the entity represented. So, for example, here you can see that we have information on, for example, the geographic location, which is also displayed in a map. We have something like a country code, some general notes. But part of the main content of the CT is also the variant name forms. There's a list that's beginning at the bottom of the screen. It goes on for quite a while, so there's all kinds of variant names for that entity as they are found, for example, in the bibliographic records in the HPB. So that might be Latinized forms, it might be misspellings, all kinds of names under which this entity can be found in actual early modern prints. What we also have is links to other information sources. So you can, for example, see under general information that there's a link to Wikipedia. And then we also have links between entities within the CT. You can see that under related records, there's about 2,900 that are somehow linked to Göttingen. So mostly, for example, personal records of people who have been born there, died there, were active there in some kind of way. So that's the kind of data that we have in the CT. It was established in 1999, as I said, mostly to improve searching in the multilingual HPB. It was openly accessible from the beginning. It was originally in a Unimark-derived internal format, and it has now been migrated to JSON in around 2018 as the sort of internal format in which the records are stored. But we've had an RDF serialization available for quite some time now. So in 2012, the first RDF serialization back then in RDF XML was made available. And if you go there today, you can get your RDF in all kinds of flavors. So XML, Turtle, serialization, JSON LD. And what we also do and have done in the past is we regularly try to enrich our records with links to other data providers. So this is something that sort of continuously happens. So the CT is also fed from a variety of data sources, both through regular harvesting and through active acquisition of sort of finished data sets. So if you find interesting databases that are in our scope, we ask the data suppliers whether we can incorporate them into the thesaurus. And then what we do is we, of course, link out to original source records. We also try to link out to authority files as much as possible. For example, the German National Library's gemeinsame Normdatei, VIAF, and so on and so forth. And most recently, we've also started linking out to other central data hubs, like, for example, Wikidata. So we've started adding some CT identifiers to Wikidata. Actually, some researchers started doing that independently, and then we, of course, jumped in and helped doing that because that's a great opportunity for creating these links. And we've also imported Wikidata identifiers into the CT to enrich the data that is present there. So some things that we've learned in doing that for the past 8 years is, so the first thing, and we've already talked about this in the session, is ontology choices really matter. And the problem is they keep mattering. It's not something that you decide once and then sort of have your ontology choice for all time. So if you look at the data at the RDF export in the CT as it is right now, it's clearly based on best practices as they were in 2012. So it's mostly RDA vocabulary with domain-specific additions. But that standard has largely fallen out of use today, so it hasn't had a massive uptake. And so it's something that we, for example, have on our to-do list as something that we want to revisit in the near future to sort of see, is that still the way that we want to present our data? Is that something that is useful to the people who work with our data? Because what we've learned is that standards really only emerge over time, and especially if you're amongst the early adopters, you will probably need to revisit your initial decisions at some point. This kind of links to the second point, which is continuity and sort of this entire question of it being an incremental process. So we've never had a particular LOD project for the CT where we said, okay, we're now going to shift this to LOD and then be done with it. It's more that we're trying to make our data accessible through current standards and technologies all the time as an incremental process in the course of our regular database enrichment, maintenance, and migration. So this is something, it's a living database. The CT continuously is updated with new records. We also check the data quality, change things around, do merging for duplicates and stuff like that. And so in the course of that, we also sort of naturally, as technologies and standards became available and mature, talk to the researchers and then iterate based on their requirements. But always with the core goal of making sure that our technology stack is stable and supported long term. And that kind of links to the third point, which is accessibility, because one of the issues that we face in sort of serving this data is that we are serving a largely non-technical audience of what I would call domain experts. So those are people, mostly book historians, who are really intimately familiar with the content of the databases, but they're not necessarily technologically adept audience who will just write Sparkle queries or something like that. So what we're trying to do in this is we aim to add new access points to our data, like, for example, Sparkle endpoints, without losing the easy-to-use interfaces that are already integrated with the workflows of the researchers in our audience. But at the same time, keep in mind that we will also want to get in touch with new audiences, for example, the digital humanities crowd. So that's the CT, which was our first LOD publication. Just having an eye on the chat, and yes, absolutely, it's never a one-time investment, but sometimes you'd think people think that it is. So let's move on to the heritage of the printed book database. So the heritage of the printed book database is in some ways a special case because it is our oldest database, and in that it kind of lives outside of that stable technology stack that I've just talked about. So it's not hosted in the same environment as our other databases, and that of course poses certain challenges when presenting it as linked open data. If you're looking at that image of the database, you probably recognize it. It's a very traditional library catalog. It was launched in 1994 as Searle's first major project. I think it was openly accessible. It was accessible in 1997. It was first hosted by Arlen, then by OCLC, and now by the VCG in Göttingen. It was initially a closed database, so it was for members of the consortium only. I think it was sort of one of the perks of membership of the consortium in the early days, that you could sort of run your copy cataloging by accessing this database. But of course, the landscape has changed dramatically since then, and it has also been open to the public in 2018 and is now an openly available resource, which has, of course, increased its usage and is a really useful resource for everyone who's working with early modern print. So it's something I'm very happy about. It is, however, still in its old technological framework. It's a traditional aggregated library catalog in PK Plus format, and with MARC being used as the sort of import-export format. And you can access it through that OPAC if you're a human being, or if you're a machine, you can also talk to it via the very library-ish protocols set 3950 and SRU. So we definitely wanted to sort of move that into the linked open data world. And so in 2019, what we did is we started on the first prototype for a full conversion of the database to RDF. And this time we did go with BibFrame as well as sort of an emerging standard for bibliographic data. I'm fully expecting to have to revisit that decision in a couple of years, but right now it seems like a good choice. And because of the way that the data works at the moment, what we did is we sort of tried to approach it from the other side this time, and sort of do a full conversion, throw it into a triple store, and then see what kinds of interfaces we can build on top of the triple store. This entire thing was planned and evaluated with input from Searle's community. So I ran some qualitative interviews with book historians who had been using the HPB before, sort of asked them about their requirements, what they would like to see, what they would not like to see, then built a prototype, gave it to them for evaluation. And we learned a lot from that process, and we also decided not to maintain this particular prototype after the evaluation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why in the next slide. Well, not the next one, but a couple one after. This one is just to show you what a prototype looked like. So basically what we try to do is we also, because we didn't expect our audience to go and write SPARQL queries, we try to give them an interface that is a lot easier to use, but still harnesses the power of SPARQL queries in some way. So we gave them an advanced search interface that basically works by selecting sort of fields that you want to search with some little twists. The first twist was that wherever we could, we try to not give people a free text search field, but a list of entities to select from, if we had managed to sort of convert something from a string to entities. And we also introduced things like, for what you can see here, the river-based search, which in the background basically goes to Wikidata and uses their property, one of my favorite Wikidata properties, located in or near a body of water, and then sort of cross-references places of publication with that property, and sort of gives you, for example, all the publications on Luther along the Rhine. And the nice thing about that interface was that it would straightforwardly take you to the search results, but it would also generate a SPARQL query in the background. And you could always click on it and get the SPARQL query and sort of analyze it and think through it if you were interested in sort of seeing how that search was constructed. And also in the display, we try to make all the links as transparent as possible. So we did some enrichment of the data. And for example, what you can see here is for the holding institutions, we try to get Wikidata items. So you would be able to do things like holdings near rivers and stuff like that if you were interested in that kind of thing. Probably less likely unless you're planning a river tour that and you want to see all the copies. What we did then is sort of insert these little links to Wikidata, for example, and then say, see the description of this library at Wikidata if you hover over it, and then you could click on it, which people hated, but I'm going to talk about it in a second. So things that we learned from that, again, ontology choices. I think that is always a big issue. We, again, try to do this based on current best practices. We will probably have to revisit it, especially because BibFrame, in the way that it's constructed, which is also why I found the previous talk very interesting, is it's geared towards librarians as users with an eye towards cataloging in it. And so it may not necessarily meet the needs of researchers who want to work with our data. And so this is something that we really have to sort of think about who our audiences really are, especially in those kinds of areas where librarianship and research very much overlap, as they do in rare books. Then about the SPARQL endpoint, from a sort of more technological point of view, that was really useful for building more complicated search queries. And I'm going to answer Anna's question in the chat immediately. No, so the interface would not give you the entire full expressivity of SPARQL, and that's a huge problem that I'm going to come back to in a second. So SPARQL is really useful for formulating these kinds of more complicated search queries, but it also presents some technical difficulties in having to sort of reconstruct records when you're trying to build these traditional interfaces. So if people expect to see records of items, then you always are in the situation of having to suddenly reconstruct the record from the graph, think about what sort of part of the graph represents a record in the traditional sense. And so one of the things that we are thinking is that it's probably better for some things to keep record-based database infrastructure, what we currently have, for record-based operations, and then treat the RDF representation as an additional layer that's mostly used for discovery, but not for fetching and displaying the records necessarily. Of course, this very much depends on the kind of data you have and the kind of presentation you want to have. And then there's this last point, and I think that's sort of the big question that's also behind Anna's question in a way, and behind my desperation when it comes to this topic, is like, there are no real standards for presenting SPARQL endpoints to human end users yet. And there is always this terrible question of usability for non-technical audiences. So I haven't really seen anything that has convinced me in terms of having a system that really reaches the full expressivity of SPARQL and still remains somehow simpler for people to use than Sparkle. So there's some attempts at building, for example, graphical Sparkle generators, and I find those more confusing than actually writing Sparkle queries. So I think this is one of the big open questions that we have to tackle, and I'm going to say a couple of words about how we're going to do that on the slide after this one. So some more challenges. I'll have to have a look at that. Maybe I looked at a lot of things. I'll check it out. Thank you. So data quality was also a huge issue. So I think data quality is always an issue when you're working with data, so I think nobody would be surprised by that. But I think it is kind of less of an issue in record-based systems that are intended for human consumption. So if you're planning to have a human being staring at a record, you will always get their capacity for intellectual understanding of errors, for them adapting their own search strategies to the erroneous nature of your data, especially if you're dealing with users as we are, who are domain experts who are really familiar with the things that are in the database. But it's much more fatal in attempts to construct linked data, for example, when generating entities from strings. We face particular challenges because of the multiple languages in the HPB, because it's an aggregated database from all over Europe and North America. And so you get records in different languages, also from different cataloging traditions. And then even within the same cataloging tradition, of course, cataloging rules change over time, and those databases are often sort of come from a huge array of data. So it's really sort of complicated to just take the strings and go to entities from them. In the CT, in the thesaurus, one of the things we do to sort of get around the problem is we do have human editors who make manual corrections. So for example, if things are potential duplicates, for example, with printers, they get marked as such, and then our human editors step in and say, yes, this is a duplicate, no, this is not a duplicate, and merge them, similar to what we saw with the merging of the works. But this is not available for the HPB for a couple of reasons, because we have a slightly different role there. It's also a very different amount of data that's in there, and a very different type of data. But we're looking at clustering things there as well. And so the last point, and the point which I find it slightly surprising, is linked data. Of course, depends on links, right? So you want to have as many links in your data as possible, linking to other things. But what we learned from the evaluation of the prototype is that you really need to distinguish in the interface between those links that are really just there for the system in the background to enable searching across databases, for example, and those links that are sort of links in the classical sense that sort of human users expect, where they want to click on it and then get some more information that's intended for them. And so this is something that happened to us with the Wikidata links, where people were at some point slightly unhappy about having those there, because if they clicked on them, they got a lot of data in a representation that they were unfamiliar with, and a lot of data that isn't really relevant for the kind of research they're doing. And so I think this is something well, you definitely want to have those links, because they enable the kind of serendipity in research questions as well. You want to have them there so people can ask those kinds of questions that you're not aware of at the point of data compilation. But you also want to think about how visible do you want to make them in your own interface. And then, of course, in a system like ours, where we sort of get data from a variety of sources, there's always this sort of big question of choosing between linking and ingestion in the first place. So of course, if we find interesting data in another person's data set, we will ask them whether we can incorporate it into the thesaurus. And then in a way, the link is still, a good source attribution. It's a reference, but it won't be necessary for the user to follow through on that link, because the information will already be in the system. Whereas for other links, they might contain information that we don't want to have in our system because we don't think it's part of our core mission. And so this is something that I think needs to be negotiated for each particular case in a way. So what we're planning to do for the future is we definitely want a Sparkle endpoint. And what we want to do is integrate it in our existing architecture. So actually go back to our current technology stack and then incorporate it there, beginning with the thesaurus and then sort of slowly making it available to our other databases as well. We actually got a small project in the plans that we're hoping to sort of do as a pilot there. We also want to continue working on the conversion of the heritage of the printed book database, not necessarily on that particular interface for the reasons that I just told you about, but definitely with the aim of making it available as a data set in that SPARQL endpoint, so you can start cross-referencing and cross-linking all of our data sets. And we definitely also want to sort of take the lessons we've learned from that prototype and incorporate them into our own current interface. And then there's this thing about interfaces. So one of the things that we're currently thinking about is it can be very useful to sort of have your own particular view on the data and have your environment that people sort of use as a first access point to the data. But as soon as you start sort of thinking of your data as a smaller point in a larger cloud, you also want to sort of start thinking about people who don't necessarily want to ask the questions that you want to ask or that you can ask with your system. And so one of the things that we want to do is also increase the accessibility and use of our LOD resources by sort of showcasing their abilities and then reaching out to communities like the digital humanities community, explaining to them how our data works, showing them the interesting things that are in our data sets, and then also collecting sort of the resources and scripts and tools they create so they can be accessed and reused by researchers who maybe don't have the ability of creating them themselves, or maybe, like write SPARQL queries, make them available in Jupyter notebooks so people can modify them, things like that are not fully fledged research environments, but sort of little ways of accessing the same data. And of course, we're also always interested in increasing the outreach and cooperation with other data providers, because I think there's a lot of untapped links in the system that we could still set up between data sets and systems. So we're always interested in finding people who have data that might be interesting for us so we can establish reciprocal links. That's all from me, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Yes, thank you. Really, really good presentation. And yeah, as Lucas notes, very good talk, all the right issues. Yeah, very, very practical and sort of, well, the things that we really encounter in the sort of the day-to-day existence in as LOD and in the linked web. There were a couple of questions and comments in the chat that you already answered, but was there?
Did I miss anything? So CCC, definitely have to check out that. Can you draw information from the linked resources back to your library interface? Clarify that question if I'm not answering it in the right way, but the way I understand it is, so at the moment, it's basically about that last point between ingestion and linking, right? So if there's some information in a linked resource that you want to have in your system as well, displayed in your interface, then you could either go and get it at runtime, sort of if somebody opens the record, then query Wikidata, get an image and display it, or you could copy the resource over to your system and then sort of display it as part of the record. It's basically a choice point. It's something that has a lot to do with the performance of the system. So of course, if you want to have a performant and reliable system, it's always better to have it in your own system if you have a performant and reliable system. But I mean, one of the big problems with SPARQL endpoints is that they are unstable and disappear. And so I tend to err on the side of ingestion here. But of course, I mean, one of the beauties of the linked open data cloud would be that you would not necessarily have to incorporate all the data. Okay, so Marion, should the outreach and communication also extend to an earlier stage shared development of ontologies? I mean, absolutely. Yes. So this is one of the things that we all have to talk about and should talk about is what vocabularies do we want to use to describe our data, and how can we make them shared and then develop standards. We're also always going to run into a problem that no one's ever going to be happy with any standard that exists. And I think that's especially a problem with the kind of data that we have, that is sort of, it's already interesting because the library world sort of needs its own standards, right? Because it has very particularly data, library data. There's this really beautiful quote from an old German book on metadata that in 1994 proclaims that library data is one of the most complicated data types that a computer can ever encounter. Not sure whether that's true, but it definitely sounds good. And then, of course, I mean, there's already, as you can see from the discussions around Ferber and BibFrame, a lot of difficulty in finding a data model that really works for everyone with respect to that. But if you enter the world of early prints, there's a lot of things that don't really match modern publications quite as well. And so you have to also think about who to talk to. I mean, that's the thing. Do we also only have to talk to the library community, or also to research communities that work on those questions and the standards they develop? But yeah, we definitely need to communicate about that. Lucas, so is your policy to maintain both a legacy record-based dataset and a separate RDF dataset for all your repositories in this? Well, I would not necessarily call our records legacy records, because we do actively maintain and migrate them. They're just not RDF natively. But they're not some kind of weird old thing that we've dusted off. But yes, so at the moment, what we're doing in the thesaurus, it's also not Mark, it's JSON. It used to be Unimark, and you can still view them in Unimark in the thesaurus, but they are natively stored in JSON in a CouchDB. And the way that it works in the system right now is that we don't store a separate RDF dataset. We generate the RDF records on the fly from the JSON records. Basically, there's a conversion routine, and whenever you request the record from the database in, let's say, JSON LD or in Turtle, it just generates it from the JSON record as it goes along. So it's not really so this is something where I think we may have to think about that when it comes to offering a SPARQL endpoint, because then of course we would like the complete data set to somehow be present in a SPARQL endpoint. And we'll have to think about how to do that, whether we would like do regular dumps and then have the RDF be slightly outdated or updated on the fly. So those are all really interesting questions. If anyone has experience with that, I'd love to talk to you. Right. The HPB is tricky, as I said, because that is in Pika Plus. Not Mark, actually, Marian. We do export and import in Mark, but it is in Pika Plus sort of as the native format. And there, because of the various ways in which it works, we might have to really sort of keep the legacy records in that sense and produce an RDF dump of it on a regular basis. Yeah. Of course, Plus is better than Mark, yes. It's also terrible in many ways, though.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, for the discussion. Thank you also for the questions to everyone who asked, and the comments and suggestions. Really lively chat, which is great to see. Now we could have the short break for getting more coffee and for stretching shoulders and necks and other limbs. Maybe a 7-minute break so that we could continue at 15 to well, whatever.
4 Central Europe.
Yeah, 15 to 4 Central European time and whatever else in other time zones. So yes, let's continue now in 6 minutes. So I'll see you. Okay. My clock is again saying that it's now 16:45, so I guess we can continue. Hopefully someone else also managed to get a fresh cup of coffee, though I admit that 6 minutes is a bit short for like a proper coffee making machine. But yeah, so welcome to the second part of the workshop. So let me just share this. Okay. For some reason, it doesn't see my PowerPoint anymore. I'll just quickly try to restart it if that helps. Okay. Yes, that did indeed help. Okay. So yeah, the second part of the workshop is indeed for this best practices of library linked open data publication document that we have been working on in the LIBER LOD working group. And indeed, the idea is to sort of go through each section of the document and then have a discussion. There were some comments already on the Google Doc that we shared with you, and some very good comments, very excellent ones indeed. And so yeah, but really feel free to add to or discuss any part of the document. So yeah, first of all, the purpose of the document are well, the idea behind the document was that it should serve as a sort of as an introduction to library LOD publishing, but that's not sort of the main point, but rather the main purpose for the document was to help structure an LOD publication project. So sort of make the planning of the project easier by showing all the sort of the steps in such a publication project. All the steps in our view, and sort of discuss what needs to be considered in such a project. The idea was not to sort of cement any hard rules as such, but rather to present options and note things that you should consider. And also the idea was that we noticed that quite a few of these LOD related documents are sort of quite technical in nature and maybe even focused on those sort of technical details. And we wanted to make this document sort of accessible to even non-technical librarians, and to sort of show the various considerations to people without like technical backgrounds. Yeah. So the first part of the document is the introduction, which includes this very short, brief introduction to linked open data, and then a discussion of LIBER's possible role in this context as a network for collecting experiences and facilitating discussion, where the idea is that LIBER has this wide network and can reach a wide audience, and using that to sort of publish something like this, this sort of best practices or guidelines type of document may result in something that allows for better interoperability if people are able to sort of consider these things from like some kind of a common starting point, so to speak. And we conducted this survey last year on linked data. There was this. We also used this larger survey by the OCLC, who has been doing like a set of surveys on library linked open data. So what we did in our survey was to sort of try to complement that OCLC survey. So sort of ask questions that we felt weren't necessarily answered in that other survey. And based on these were sort of one of the key starting points for this whole document. And then we wanted to include an example project, or maybe two example projects. Currently, we have one, which is the Serral that was presented by Andreas. It's in the document itself. There's like quite a short description, and then a slightly longer one in the as an appendix. We are open to having another case study. So if you are interested in providing an example of a library LOD publication project, please let us know, and we'll see. And so that's basically the introduction. So now I would welcome any input from you about the sort of the purpose of the document and the maybe the various topics covered in the introduction, and also as a sort of a question, we briefly go through the difficulty of measuring success and impact of a linked open data publication project, in the sense that if your data is like freely available, it can be difficult to sort of track who is using it and what they are doing it, and how well it's, or how much it is being used, and things like that. So if you have any input on that topic, that would also be very welcome. Now my problem is that I can't see the chat while I'm sharing, so I'll stop sharing for the moment. Are there any library consortium members in the audience who have published their data as LOD? Is a general question to the workshop attendees.
And anybody can provide links, and we're gonna aggregate everything in the notes section. So after the presentation, we will have all the links together if someone wants to share their linked open data project.
Yes, yes. We'll be gathering from the chat to the notes section, and then the notes will be emailed to each participant after the workshop. So, yeah. So yes, yeah, and here's a good question about the data, and it was actually one of the notes in the the early comments to the document as well. In the Google Doc, there was a note that defining what the data set is would be useful, and that's very true, because library linked open data publication can certainly be like a thesaurus or something like that, which isn't necessarily always thought of as a library data set as such. So some discussion on that. Yeah. Yeah, there are multiple library collection metadata types, bibliographic, archives, museum objects, and they require partly different approaches. Very true. Yeah. And this is well, as was in the conclusions of the document, that everything sort of depends on the type of data, and that's certainly something that is very evident in all over the document. So anybody who is publishing data from their library has to specify what kind of data it is. I think there is no need in this general document to limit the types of data. Yes, I agree. And I think that there are references to sort of other types of data, or I mean, other than bibliographic data along the document, but it isn't spelled out that what we mean by data or library data or a data set or whatever. So definitely something that should be included and at the very beginning in the of the document, or well, not necessarily the very beginning, but early on in the document. Okay, maybe I'll go forward. Is the discussion of how to make your data reliable and permanent over time, updating problems, alignment, etc., part of this document? Yes and no. Yeah, that's indeed a very good topic to talk about, and there was already a mention in the earlier comments from Lucas that there should be some discussion in the document about the URIs, for example, of how to make them permanent, how to keep them or persistent, and how to keep them functional. And that's certainly something that ties readily to that. So how to make the data reliable and permanent over time. And yeah, and also, like, for example, maintaining links, that once you link to something, you should then have some plan of how you're going to maintain those links and keep them up to date, and it's especially interesting when the links are two-way. So, for example, to Wikidata, linking to Wikidata and including the links both in Wikidata and in your own data, and then keeping them in sync and up to date. So certainly a topic worth discussing. I'll go over to the next. Okay, well. Yep. No. Okay. Yeah. So the document is sort of divided, or the publication process is sort of divided into 6 steps in the document. So first of all, the planning step, then the sort of the data modeling step, which is comprised of 3 steps: choosing and curating the data set, identifying the resources to link to, and then schema and vocabularies, which was actually the name was changed quite late, and I forgot to update this graphic. And now, of course, I can't even remember what it was. Applying a model, element sets and value vocabularies was the was the name of the fourth step. Yeah, because we thought that schema and vocabularies wasn't first of all, it wasn't very approachable to linked data beginners necessarily, and second of all, it didn't really maybe tell the sort of the whole story of the step. So yes, and these three steps, the data modeling steps, are sort of very intertwined. So they aren't like strictly chronological steps as such, but rather that you will go back and forth between them when doing the actual work, most likely. And the fifth step, converting the data, and then finally making the data available. And I mean, this is certainly not the only possible way of dividing an LOD publication process into distinct steps. This was just something that we came up with, and felt that it gave a certain flow and structure to the document. But certainly other ways of dividing the process are possible. And then, well, as a general question, is there anything that falls outside of these steps? Is there something that should be discussed in the document that you feel is an important topic to discuss and that falls outside of these steps as such? So yeah, the first step, planning the publication process. Well, there we go through these 5 topics. So first of all, you need to sort of decide on the scope of the project. So what are your aims and how ambitious you are, and things like that. Then you need to sort of check the human resources that you have available. So who will actually be doing the work, what they know of linked open data, and maybe about the tools and processes and so on related to it. Do they need maybe some training beforehand, or is there like a guide that they should read or something like that? Then the tools, meaning that if you have some software that for example already produces RDF data, or alternatively, if you need some like very specific tools to process your data. And then resources, as in one of the questions that we asked in the survey was on the sort of the what are the main costs in LOD publication, and well, maybe very expected, but the consensus was that for the overwhelming majority of the projects, it's basically the human labor that is the main cost, and that's probably going to be true for the vast majority of projects. And then finally, the steps and milestones, so sort of the project management part of how do you divide the project into different parts, and how to sort of evaluate and so on between them. So I'll stop sharing at this point and check the chat. And I mean, feel free to also ask for the permission to speak. If you have a mic, you are very welcome to also speak. Okay.
I think there is that question by Odrun.
Yes.
The other, yeah.
The question on overall approach. Many libraries manage several types of datasets, both authority data, typically files of person names, geographical names, thesauri, subject headings, so on, that are referenced in the bibliographical descriptions. Should these be converted to LOD before the bibliographical records are published as LOD? Yeah. That's something that I don't think that we discuss explicitly in the document. There are some references to it, but that's indeed a topic that should probably be sort of discussed as a topic, as it's obviously something that everyone will run into, and that's a great point. And then there was also the suggestion that there might be a seventh step in maintaining the data, which is also a great idea. And there in the during the presentations there was this conversation already that many libraries consider these, or the management of the libraries might consider this LOD publication project as sort of done once, and then it has been done and everything is great, but rather sort of to emphasize the continual nature of this. That's certainly not a bad idea.
Back to the question of Odrun, there was Lucas, Amarilis, and Anna. They wrote some answers. If maybe some of them would like also to turn the microphone on and maybe elaborate a little about the authority data.
Oh, here, Lucas, if I may.
Yeah.
So if I look at our own environment, so we are at the beginning of actually starting to publish our library data as open data, and linked data will be at the very end. I expect. So we use a lot of we use external authority files, mainly for people, authors, organizations, subjects, etc. And they are in the form of strings, but for many of them, it's a real legacy system with a lot of history. But for many of the records, they also contain the identifiers of the terms in the external authority files, and we can use these to construct the actual links, the URIs to. Someone muted me, but did you hear everything I said?
It was. I think that you were cut off in the when you said that the links can be used to.
You constructed from the internally stored identifiers into the published URIs. For instance, for the Library of Congress subcommittees, etc. That's just something you can do on the we could do on the fly probably, instead of enriching the data, because that's a lot of work. It could also all happen, but that's one thing that is possible. But as the presentation of Andreas, they publish their own thesaurus, of course, because they're the ones who actually maintain their own thesaurus. If you have your own thesaurus and you want to publish your stuff as linked data, then you should probably at some point make your thesaurus also linked or linkable. But you can start with, you have to, you mustn't do everything in once, but just take small steps. That's my advice. Anyway.
Yeah, that's certainly excellent advice, and I agree fully. And we do mention in the document the sort of the concept of reconciliation, where you can replace the sort of that when your data refers to entities, you can replace those entities with more well-known ones from other vocabularies, such as the Library of Congress subject headings or wherever, which sort of slightly ties into your point, but yeah, that's definitely something that should be discussed, and excellent feedback. Thank you.
If I may just try to, well, I'm a beginner. I'm starting to work with linked open data, and actually I'm from Brazil, so I don't know how I could just I intend to follow your work here and just see how you're working in Europe, but and actually I asked it how to adopt, for example, external linked data that is already published, if I could, or if I adopted, for example, the subjects from Library of Congress, they are all in English. So maybe I should, I don't know if I should adopt it, because not all my users speak English. So how can I offer this kind of subject headings for Brazilians that don't speak English? On the other hand, if I have to do all the work they have already done to convert my index or my subject indexes and convert it or publish it as linked data. So that's why Audrum's question was something that I was thinking as well. Must I produce my own linked data, or how to adopt externals, or it's not nice to adopt externals completely? I don't know, maybe I'm kind of lost just because I'm starting and you're all experts, but here came up some interesting subjects, some interesting topics. Thank you.
No, that's certainly a very valid question, and something that I think that everyone sort of bumps into. Well, everyone aside from the Library of Congress, I guess. So, and especially if your data is in some other language than in English, that's certainly something that's a challenge. And in our case, I come from the National Library of Finland. We mapped our own thesaurus or our own vocabulary to the Library of Congress subject headings, but that was a huge amount of work, and the mapping is far from well. We had a lot of concepts that weren't in the Library of Congress subject headings. Some were like, many of them are such concepts that they probably cannot be there, or they are very Finland specific, for example. So that's certainly most certainly a valid question, and I don't know if there are any like complete answers to that one. Other than a huge amount of work, basically. But yeah, I think that including a discussion at least on this topic into the document would be very fruitful, as there are certainly several sort of viewpoints to discuss and consider. And then, do you think that it makes sense to reconcile all sorts of terms coming from different element sets and value vocabularies? It is becoming a possible need when bringing together data from different sources, which also require maintaining a local tradition. I think that's sort of probably one of the reasons why Andreas's ancient book mentioned that library data is the most complex data that a computer can encounter. But really, a lot of bibliographic data is very very domain specific and very sort of finely annotated. With using thesauri and using vocabularies and resources tied to that very specific domain, and mapping those to something more generic is might not be possible, and even if possible, will probably sort of miss a lot of the richness and the nuance of the original data. Yeah, again, certainly, again, a point that probably should be discussed in the document as yeah. And Andreas is typing something that there is a lot of work required, but vocabularies also provide a lot of potential when it comes to multilingual data, because you might be able to reuse the concepts of, for example, Library of Congress subject headings while attaching your own localized labels to them. Yes, most certainly. I think that especially or language is certainly like a super interesting part of this set of challenges that we are trying to tackle, and there I think that it's sort of the LOD opens up possibilities. Well, as you note, mapping between concepts, between languages, is something that sort of can be a strength of this approach. But there are also natural challenges in that some concepts in some languages might be a bit difficult to translate, and there might be some nuance lost, and it might not be easy to note when it is lost, and especially when you then publish a data set that uses that vocabulary to make sure that all the annotations are correct, even when translated into the matches that if you have mapped the vocabulary to another vocabulary, then the data that uses the original vocabulary doesn't match then the second vocabulary. Okay, great. Excellent. Okay, maybe we can go forward to the next set of next step. So step number 2, choosing and curating the dataset. So there we go. It's sort of in 2 parts. There's the dataset selection, and then data curation and cleanup, or as Lucas suggested, data curation and data transformation. So the dataset selection, sort of going through the, well, here we sort of mentioned that the various types of content that a library dataset might have, and what types of entities are used, and what types of metadata schemas and so on. But this would probably be the right section to talk about the different types of datasets, as Lucas actually mentioned in the comment on the document. Then the size of the dataset is naturally something that affects the way that you can affects the ways that you can process the data set. So if it's a small data set, it might be feasible to go manually through it in some ways, but if it's a large one, you need some automation and and so on. So it kind of changes the whole process depending on the size of the data set. Then the data quality, which was actually talked about a bit in the chat as well earlier on. So the data quality in library data or library data quality as opposed to linked open data quality, and what's the difference between these sort of two types of qualities and so on. Then one good topic, the uniqueness, popularity, and reuse. So sort of trying to identify what makes your data set unique, what might be the popular ways of using it and reusing it, and what are sort of the features that you need to retain in order to have it be useful for as many as possible. And finally, naturally, the ownership and privacy concerns. So are you allowed to publish your dataset, or are you allowed to publish everything in it, or should you cut some parts away, for example? And then the data curation and cleanup or data transformation. This the comment about going from cleanup to data transformation was about the fact that in some cases, or actually in probably quite many cases, you might not actually be cleaning up your data at your database, but rather making a copy of your data and then cleaning that up or going through it. So specifically for the linked open data publication. Yeah. And now I'll again come back to the chat. Yeah, one approach is to select a multilingual hub and map several vocabularies to that. Typical hub is dual, for example. And yeah, that's true. Having like a central multilingual hub is probably the most practical approach. And as Anna notes, some concepts might not align, but it's still probably better than not trying to do it at all. And then that the compromise is always unsatisfying. Yeah, that's true. Okay, and then Alex, concerning the cleaning up of data, when the original or the legacy system lives on for cataloging, for example, and is used to update the LOD dataset regularly, the data cleaning should take place there. Yeah, that's true. And this sort of comes back to the point about this being like a continual process. So when you are doing things to your data, they should be done in a way that is that you can do it again someday, and hopefully as automated as possible, so that you can keep the LOD data up to date and sort of synchronized with your actual database data, so to say. To sum up, we will not get rid of the dirty data in legacy systems by moving on to RDF. Well, probably not until we move to the actual library systems to RDF. Yeah, cleaning up the data source is not always possible in the short run with a huge legacy database with national cataloging profiles. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that of course presupposes that you can express everything you want to express in the legacy format. Yeah, that's because, well, for example, the links in the linked open data might prove problematic to the original database, and or for example, well, we had some difficulty with when we moved from monolingual thesauri to a multilingual linked data vocabulary. There was some challenges with representing the language of the term in the MARC record, which we were able to overcome, but not necessarily in a very yeah, that's true. MARC now has the zero field for URIs, yeah, and that's a super welcome addition. But I mean, the library system might not be able to make use of that that URI addition like natively, at least not straight away. So yeah, I certainly agree with Andreas that you might have some features in the LOD data that might be difficult to sort of put into the original library system database that you had, for example. Okay. Well, many datasets, geonames, Wikidata, VIAF, and so on are mentioned in the document, but is there a source of linked open data to know those that already exist? Yes and no. Yeah, Bartok as Anna linked, that includes quite a few, well, a huge amount of vocabularies, and so that's certainly one starting point. And then naturally the linked open data cloud also has quite a few, but I don't know how easy those are to sort of navigate or trying to sort of find the correct ones from there if you are just starting out. So we hoped to include in the document sort of the central ones, or at least a selection of them that are most commonly used in the library domain, and that actually brings us very nicely to the next point. But I don't know why, but this forgets my PowerPoint. So just a moment. This screen sharing, I mean, forgets or doesn't show my PowerPoint for some reason. But when I restart the PowerPoint, it again finds it. So yeah. So we get to the third step of identifying the resources to link to, where we first discuss the importance of linking, which is naturally a sort of very central concept to the linked open data. and then, as I already mentioned, the idea of reconciliation and also named entity recognition. So finding in the data the people and the places, for example, that should be made into entities and assigned URIs and maybe linked to other resources and so on. And then we list the most frequently used datasets by libraries based on the OCLC and our own survey. So there's 14 datasets that are listed. That hopefully serves as a sort of a starting point. It isn't meant to be like a comprehensive list, and certainly not meant to be a suggestion that you shouldn't go outside of this list or anything like that. But just as a sort of a starting point of good datasets to link to. And finally, we included a linking example to sort of make it more, hopefully make it more. Make it easier to understand what we are talking about. And step 4, which indeed changed its name at the sort of late in the process from vocabularies and schemas to applying a model, element sets, and value vocabularies. And this is actually something that I find somewhat maybe difficult or problematic is the sort of the concept of what the vocabulary is. That for example a doubling core or both or RDA can be vocabularies, but also the Library of Congress subject headings can be called a vocabulary. So we try to call them value vocabularies to sort of differentiate from the sort of the schemas or those sorts of vocabularies. But yeah, so first of all, we talk about this opening library silos while avoiding LOD silos, sort of in the vein that was in the first presentation of today. Then we go through the various bibliographic models. Again, as the first and the second presentation today, and then through the element sets and possible value vocabularies. So yeah, and now I again stop sharing and check the chat. Yeah, named entity recognition is very high-level machine learning based technology. Contact the appropriate researchers in your institution. Yeah, that's true. Not for the faint of heart, and it's not very simple. But just to sort of to note, and yeah, the idea was to explore looking for some LOD for certain areas of interest like architecture, urban planning, and design. Yeah, that's exactly finding a widely used vocabulary or value vocabulary, for example, for a specific domain. That certainly can be a challenge, and it isn't necessarily obvious. I mean, you can search for them in for example at Bartok, but finding the sort of the correct one to use isn't necessarily easy. I mean, the sort of the generic or the general, as in Wikidata or things like that are good starting points, but then when you are trying to describe some domain for the domain experts, they probably aren't enough. for non-bibliographic vocabularies, look at EDM and CDOC or mix and match. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, CDOC is certainly okay, and see if my okay. Now I understand why the PowerPoint goes missing. It's if I minimize it, the screen sharing doesn't recognize it anymore. So okay. So then the fifth step is converting the data, and they will mention that there are some ready-made solutions for sort of for some conversions, but usually some tinkering is required. So probably some technical expertise, and that the specific implementation is not all that important. Meaning the specific implementation. For example, whether you use Python or Java or XSLT or whatever to make the conversion, that doesn't matter all that much. So you should go with the one that has ready-made solutions or that your technical people are familiar with. But what you need is a mapping, most likely, at least. So you need a mapping between the elements and the features of the original dataset to the LOD or the original dataset schema. I mean, to the LOD schema. And finally, we talk a bit about the importance of verification of the result of the conversion. So you need to somehow verify that the quality that you sort of retain the quality, whatever the quality means, whether it's the LOD quality or the library quality, as was discussed before. But here we suggest that the people who made the data, who work with it day by day, the librarians, that they should be involved in the process of verification, because they obviously are the ones who know what it should look like. So yeah, but again, here the size of the data is something that changes this step quite a bit. That if you have a small data set, then it's easier to go through it by hand, or at least get a good general overview of it by hand. But if the data set is very large and has multiple types of data, then the verification step is more difficult. But here we had quite a few excellent comments from Lucas into the Google Doc, that in many cases it is not possible to distinguish between cleaning and converting data. You leave the original source data as they are and export and transform the data to cleaned and qualitatively better separate datasets in various data record and syntax formats. RDF is one specific record format with various syntax formats or serializations such as JSON, LD, Turtle, and so on. Yes, should probably be made clearer. One of the main issues here, and not mentioned in this document as far as I can see, is the planning and implementation of persistent identifiers /HTTP URIs for the actual things that you will be publishing linked data for. This must be dereferenceable supporting content negotiation, and most of all persistable. There are many choices to be made here. Yes, indeed, a discussion on the URIs and the persistent identifiers is something that should be included here. I actually think that we probably had that point in our own notes that it should be included, but it was kind of I don't know, forgotten. And yeah, the sort of the world of persistent identifiers is something that isn't necessarily easy to penetrate for beginners, and I mean, it's not overly complex. I don't mean that, but it's something that might not be very intuitive, and might not be something that you would consider in the planning stages if you aren't familiar with it. So yes, most certainly something that should be discussed. And then there was the mention that this mapping might be very or you might not be easy when you are converting string values to URIs, so that in your original data you have like a name of a person, and then in the LOD you want to have the URI of that person. And that's an excellent point. What we were discussing, what we meant by the in the mapping was a mapping between schemas, but indeed we also should consider the mapping between the sort of the value vocabularies or the values, for example, the terms in the original data, and then the linked data entities or resources in the final publication. So yeah, again, most certainly something that should be included here, and it's just yeah, should be there. Oh, and an article about persistent identifiers. Yeah, good. I'll check that out. Yeah, and Kathmandu, a good transformation tool for bibliographic formats. Yeah, can certainly recommend. Okay, and then the final step is making the data available. So indeed, this maybe should be the second to last step, with the final step being maintaining the data. But yeah, making the data available, sort of again, three topics: how to serve your data, so data dumps for download in several formats, and then some mention on the Sparkle endpoint and the difficulties of it. As Andreas talked about, there's quite a bit to unpack in Sparkle for beginners, and it's a shame that it's so difficult to use, as it is one of the most sort of useful or one of the most readily useful aspects of LOD publication is the immense power of Sparkle that allows you to do amazing things with it. Then we talk about documentation and licensing. So how do you document the data set, and what sort of license? Well, naturally an open license, but some discussion on that, and how this documentation and license information should be included in the data itself, so that if the data set goes moving around as linked open data sets are supposed to have the documentation and the license information included within the data set is a good idea. And finally, some thoughts on how to make your data known. So data catalogs, whether it's your own library data catalog or indeed one of these aggregating sites that sort of get these data sets from all over. And then the final part of the document is sort of lists some other resources, so linked data for libraries, linked data for production, and the linked open data cloud are mentioned. And then in the conclusions, well, it's a very short conclusion so far. Maybe something else could be written, but one of the as already mentioned, one of the chief conclusions is that everything depends on the type of data and the type of the data set, so the size and indeed what it contains. And then indeed proper planning goes a long way. So sort of and I mean that's the purpose of the document. So that's maybe a sort of a circular conclusion or a tautology or something like that. But the idea that if you can have a clear view of the publication project in advance and sort of plan for every step along the way as far as possible or as sort of comprehensively as possible, then that helps quite a bit. And finally, we included a list of suggested reading. We were a bit pressed for time for that one, so we actually hope to sort of maybe include a short a sentence on each item in the list to sort of why or what it contains and why it should be read or something like that. But yeah, as a sort of a final question for everyone at the workshop is that where do you discuss library linked open data? So what are the sort of the forums that you use and where you can sort of find the communities and the support and have the discussions and so on, at least when you aren't in a workshop. And so yeah, any comments on that is a good question. Should we create another forum? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but well, at least one good forum is the SWIB conference. Yeah. Okay. Lucas posted the link. So yeah, this year also online, and deadline for the abstracts is 13th July. So consider that one. It's semantic web in libraries, a very sort of a very friendly conference and very squarely aimed at these topics. So certainly one good place to discuss these things at least once a year. And ELAG is another. Yeah, that's a good shout out as well. So well, I can't even remember what the acronym is about. Automation something. Yeah, but it cancelled this year. Yeah. mini ELAG later this year online. Okay, I wasn't actually aware of that. That's good information. European Library Automation Group. Yes, thank you, Akim. Yeah. So the next steps for us, the LIBER linked open data group, is to finalize the document that we have been discussing. So basically, adding in all the excellent suggestions that we got. Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Lucas, for joining us. Really appreciate it. Yeah, we hope to. There's of course summer vacations and things like that, but we hope to sort of publish the final version of the document in autumn with these additions. Yeah. So we are approaching the end of the workshop. You are very welcome to still write comments. But yeah, I wish to thank our presenters for the excellent presentations. They were really good and super topical, and they build on one another very nicely. So yeah, and also huge thanks to all the people who joined the discussion, the chat. Excellent points were raised, and I think that adding these things to the document will certainly make it way better, and yeah. The European BibFrame workshop, next one will be virtual in September. Yeah, that's a good add. Yeah. So I guess I'll wish everyone a great summer and a great rest of the LIBER conference. And yeah, so thank you, and I hope that we'll see each other in the flesh sometime in the future as well. So yeah, thank you everyone.